Mitoma or Mbeumo, which one of these 6.5 million midfielders should we be prioritising for our Game Week 1 drafts? Don't you worry, I've got you covered in this video. I'm going to be discussing all of that later on, so make sure you do drop a like on this video. Make sure you do smash the subscribe button. You legends are getting us closer to 6k, and I am massively grateful. So without further ado, let's take a look at these 6.5 million midfielders. Yes guys, okay, so no messing about, straight into the heart of the main topic, which is which one of Mitoma or Mbeumo should we own? These are currently the most owned 6.5 midfielders going into Game Week 1 as we speak. A shout out to Fantasy Football Fix for the graphics and the underlying data that we'll be using in this video. So first up, let's take a look at the touch heat maps for both Mitoma and Mbeumo last season. Mitoma, we can see here, is the trademark heat map that we have come to expect. Him hugging the touchline in this Brighton system and then coming in off the left flank to either be a goal scoring threat or a creative influence. But we saw much more of a goal threat in Mitoma's play. Mbeumo, on the other hand, operating on the right hand side. However, the system that he was playing in did change throughout the season. We either saw him as a right of a front three or up top alongside an Toney, and at times being the main forward in the absence of Toney due to injury. But importantly as well, what we can see from here is Mbeumo also taking some set pieces, which is important to consider when we are looking at these two 6.5 million options. But based on the touch heat maps alone from last year, you can see that they both get considerable amount of touches in their respective flanks in the box, and also have a responsibility in the team to hog the touchline in their sides. So I don't think there's too much to judge off based on these heat maps alone, but I do think it is worth just getting a visualization on how exactly they do get deployed in their teams. But we know with Brentford, with the absence of Toney, we need to have a little bit more of an analysis over pre-season to see how that will impact Mbeumo going into this new season. Now, of course, we need to dive into the underlying stats, the juicy stuff of last season. And we have a comparison here per 90 minutes of Mitoma and Mbeumo across the course of the season. And this here just gives us a bit of an understanding on how very, very similar they were from an output perspective last year. You can see goals per 90 being almost identical at 0.28. And the XG for both as well being very, very similar. Mitoma just leading the way at 0.33 per 90. But once again, the shots per 90 are so much similar, and shots on target as well. But importantly, the one that I really do like to get a bit of an understanding from is the shots in the box. Realistically, when we do look at shots, that could be great. But if they are going to be 40-yard thunderbolts, then I'm not really interested in that. I want to see the players that are taking those shots in the box. And once again, both of these are very, very similar. Mitoma at 1.78 per 90 and Mbeumo at 1.72. Again, is one of them a more creative threat than the other? Not necessarily. Attempted assists are almost identical. Expected assists for both are almost identical. So when we are looking at these two from last season in isolation as FPL options, they are pretty much identical output for what they've done in their respective teams. And I've made a note of that there. Very similar underlying numbers. But what I really do want to make sure is a caveat going into the new season is with the absence of Toney, if Mbeumo was to become the sole penalty taker in this Brentford team, I think that really does bring a different dynamic to the underlying stats that we need to consider going into the new season. Both Mitoma and Mbeumo weren't their penalty takers for their teams. But if we were to add that extra string to Mbeumo's bow going into the new season, that could mean that the underlying stats are going to improve in Mbeumo's season, which we do need to consider in pre-season. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of information. But what is important is the absence of Toney going into this new season. And in the next slide, I have a little bit of a comparison on how Mbeumo performed in Toney absence last year. So here we have a comparison between Mbeumo with Toney on the field and without Toney on the field from last season. And I want to quickly caveat this by saying that Mbeumo only played 450 minutes without Toney on the field compared to 2,500 with Toney. So Toney was a bit of an ever-present in the team last year, only 450 minutes without him. But I still think it is worth us comparing the underlying numbers just to see if we can see a trend going into this pre-season, as it may help us out with our decision making. But again, it is a very small sample size without Toney on the field. But what a crazy change in the underlying numbers. 1 goal per 90 compared to 0.15, but the XG per 90 for Mbeumo goes through the roof at 0.73 compared to the previous 0.23. The shots are doubled. The shots on target are doubled. Everything has pretty much been going through the roof in the absence of Ivan Toney. And it really does look like Mbeumo has taken it upon himself to be the complete goal threat in this team. Now, it's important to note that, again, first and foremost, the data size is incredibly small. But we need to know whether this is going to be a theme going into the new season. With the likes of Vissa and Sade, the new signing, are we going to see Mbeumo be the number 9 in this system? Or are they going to be looking to play maybe a Vissa down the middle and Mbeumo off the right with a bit more of a chaotic front three, then rotating with one another, being dependent on the match situation? So I don't think we can come to any conclusions based on what we're reading here, but it is very exciting to see this, knowing that Mbeumo without Ivan Toney can be an incredible FPL option at 6.5 million. But for me, being a guy who likes his underlying numbers, I can't draw to a conclusion just because the sample size is so small. But I think it's really important that we do have a note of this in our minds, because if we see in pre-season Mbeumo hit the ground running, score bags of goals, but importantly his average positioning looking really good, we know that these numbers could be replicated going into this season, and it's definitely something we need to have on our radars. Now, I want to quickly move away from the actual individuals themselves and kind of pan out to the teams and how they performed last season. As we know, Brighton was such a fantastic team last year, such an exciting team, and you can see that with the underlying numbers here. Brighton were top 3 team for XG per 90, only Liverpool and Man City beating them, very close to the 2 XG per 90, which is kind of like the holy grail when we are considering teams and FPL options. So we know when we're investing in their attack, we are getting a team that are going to be creating a bag full of chances for their attacking options. And importantly as well, Brighton are first for most shots per 90 minutes, which again is something we do need to consider. It isn't a stat that we should just kind of throw away, not really consider. These all count when we are considering our FPL options for our teams. Now, Brentford, on the other hand, are not as bad as I thought XG per 90. We can see that on your screens there, 1.45 XG per 90, which is decent. Again, it isn't like the 1 XG per 90 where there's such a big discrepancy between the two. And we are comparing Brentford to a Brighton team that are a top 3 side in terms of underlying numbers. So Brentford, I wouldn't be too scared at that XG per 90. They still create chances for the team. However, the one thing I was a little bit worried about was Brentford were only 0.87 open play goals per 90 compared to Brighton's 1.47, which does say to me there's a little bit more of an emphasis on set piece goals within the side. Does that enhance Mbeumo as an option? I don't know if it necessarily does, because we know with Brentford they are very strong from corners. If Mbeumo is going to be the man taking the corners, then of course that is great. That's a bonus as an FPL option. But if they are relying on set pieces for goals, then I kind of want to go for the FPL option that actually has the open play numbers and the team funneling those through that player. And Brighton definitely seem to have that in their system. Now, of course, the argument for being without Ivan Toney can be flipped to Brighton. How are they going to perform without McAllister? How are they going to perform with most likely Caicedo out of the team? That is something that we do definitely need to understand. But from a team perspective from last season, Brighton are definitely leading the way, and I would probably prefer to have an investment in their attacking options rather than Brentford's based on the team alone. And looking at the fixtures of both Brighton and Brentford, they do make for some interesting reading. Now, I think we probably know right now within the FPL community, but if you don't, the first 3 for Brighton are absolutely fantastic. They start the season at home against newly promoted Luton, a very difficult fixture for us to kind of understand how it is going to be. One would argue it could be a 6-0 thrashing from Brighton. The other may say that Luton might put up a resolute performance and it'll be a low-scoring affair. I really don't know what way that is going to go, but I do feel like having an investment in that fixture is quite important for our teams, as it could be one of those that could go off. Wolves away in game week 2. We know with Wolves that they can be at home a tough team to crack, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad fixture for Brighton. And game week 3 is looking like a good fixture as well at home against West Ham. West Ham last season, a very unpredictable team, but wouldn't necessarily say that that is a fixture that Brighton can't go off in. I think there's definitely an opportunity for them to score goals in, so I wouldn't be put off by that. But in game weeks 4, game weeks 5, the fixtures do start to turn a little bit. 6, they're good, but then after that, they do get really, really tricky for Brighton. So I think there is an argument to say that if you were to invest in a Brighton attacker, you may look to maybe move away from game week 4 onwards and invest elsewhere. Or if Brighton do continue their close to 2 XG per 90, we could just ignore the fixtures and know that they can put these numbers up against any team, any game week. But I do think it is worth noting that the first 3 in particular are fantastic for Brighton. Now, looking at Brentford's, I think game week 1 looks a lot harder than what it is. Spurs at home, under a new manager, with the defensive frailties that they do have, I could foresee a high-scoring game in this one. I think the understanding in pre-season and what we have heard about Tottenham is that they're going to be a bit more of a free-flowing team. We're not going to be seeing the Antonio Conte 10 men behind the ball. I think they are going to be a more excited team, therefore opportunities are going to arise for teams to hurt them. So I do think there's going to be goals in that game, so I wouldn't be put off by Mbeumo's first game. Away against Fulham, not a bad fixture at all, and then a good fixture at home against Crystal Palace, followed by Bournemouth at home and Everton at home in game week 6. So I think realistically what we are looking at is both teams have good fixtures, but I think long term, if you are looking at not penciling a transfer potentially, Mbeumo might be the one to hold long term until you potentially wildcard after game week 6 or 7. I think if you want to just double down on the opening 3 fixtures, I think Mitoma is the right move, especially when we are looking at those overall team stats. Posting nearly 2 XG per 90 against a newly promoted Luton team, that could be the recipe for serious FPL returns. Now, I know you guys want to know which was better, Mitoma or Mbeumo, but we need to remember there are other 6.5 million options available. I know what you're saying. Yes, Nacho, I know it's Mudryk. No, Mudryk is not an option at 6.5 million at any cost. So these ones are, though. I have 4 on your screens here. Almiron, Eze, March and Pascal Gross. Really, really interesting that we have 2 other Brighton options at 6.5 million that I need to be considered. And also we have the likes of Enciso at 5.5, but I will do a separate video regarding that. So make sure you do subscribe as you want to stay up to date with all of that kind of stuff. So looking at the XG per 90 for these 4 assets in particular, we have Almiron at 0.29, a player that hit the ground running last year, but kind of petered off as it continued. Eze at 0.23 became so much more of a goal threat under Roy Hodgson as what he was under Patrick Vieira. And I think we do need to remember the Eze of the second half of the season rather than at the start. I think that is the more realistic one we are going to see this year. So that's really promising to see going into this season. Solly March, 0.28 XG per 90, slightly below Mitoma's. What a well-rounded asset he was, because when his XA is looking under 0.28 XA per 90, he was the best overall Brighton option last season. He just didn't have that kind of excitement that Mitoma gave us as FPL managers. And Pascal Gross as well, 0.15 XG, but an XA of 0.28, so decent underlying numbers. And importantly, with the absence of McAllister, we may see Pascal Gross step up as the penalty taker. I think the assumption in the community is that he will be the #1 penalty man, but again, we need to see that in pre-season. So what are my thoughts on each option? First and foremost, Almiron. Unfortunately, I am not considering him at 6.5 million. The fixtures for Newcastle are very difficult. And importantly, with Anthony Gordon most likely getting more game time this season and the impending signing of Harvey Barnes, that is just going to be extra competition on those wide flanks for Almiron. And I don't think he is a consideration at 6.5, unfortunately. But he will be one to keep on the radar at all times. Eze is the one that I really do like the look of as a complete alternative. He was such a goal threat under Roy Hodgson. My only worry is, what are we going to see with the absence of Olise missing the start of the season and without Wilfried Zaha? We either see Eze step up as the main man, kind of Zaha 2.0, and takes the reins and completely dominates Crystal Palace games, or we are going to see Crystal Palace in general regress as a team. One thing I have is Crystal Palace as a team really don't post the XG that the likes of Brighton do. And that's my main worry, is I like investing in players that play for teams that accumulate high XG. If Crystal Palace are only going to maybe have 1.2 XG per game, it doesn't get me as excited as the other 6.5 million options that they play for in their team. So Eze is 100% on the radar, but I don't get as excited as what the likes of Mitoma or the Brighton options could do for us. In terms of March and Pascal Gross, the big thing for me is, where does Gross play? Is he going to play at the bottom of that box that they like to play? If that's the case, although he might have penalties, he isn't really a consideration for me. He could be rolled out at right back. He could play at the top of a box. We really don't know. So for me, I'm going to park Pascal Gross right now unless we see something incredible in the preseason period. So it comes down to, is Solly March a better option than Mitoma in that Brighton midfield? And although as a well-rounded option, Solly March definitely leads the way, expected goals involvement is actually higher than Mitoma's, I just prefer Mitoma as an option. My worry is for someone like Solly March is Enciso, João Pedro, all coming into the team this season and most likely to get more minutes. I just feel like Mitoma's position is a bit more concrete than that of Solly March's. So although preseason is going to be super important, right now I would much rather go for Mitoma than Solly March, as I feel like he's much more of an important cog in the system than that of Solly March. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. I think it's a really interesting debate to have. Right then, so to conclude this video, where do I rank the 6.5 million midfielders? So in third place, I have got Eze. Realistically, if he is going to step up as talisman, even if a team do knock around 1.2 XG per game, I like the idea of investing in the absolute talisman in that team. And that is why Eze is picking up the third spot. I need to see a lot from them in pre-season to know whether they are going to be a better team. Because right now, as an FPL manager, I feel like them keeping Roy Hodgson on is actually going to be negative for Palace. I think they had that nice honeymoon period last year. I don't know if Hodgson's got it in him to really go again this year. So the fixtures are tough, especially away for Crystal Palace. And as I said, it is a little bit unclear how they will perform with the absence of Elise and Zaha. But as long as he's a talisman and he is the differential out of the lot, he is absolutely on the radar. But I think the other two are better options. And in second place, it is just going to go for Mbeumo. This isn't a case of Mbeumo here and Mitoma here. This is very much like this. So don't read too much into it. If he is the penalty taker and he's confirmed in that Brentford team, then realistically that puts these two neck and neck for me. Because having penalties at 6.5 million is incredibly hard to ignore. Pre-season will be important to understand that. And in particular, how Brentford are going to manage without Ivan Toney. I know the stats look fantastic for Mbeumo last year, but I want to see how they do set up this year, knowing that they don't have Toney for 8 months. Last year, it was like, oh, we don't have him for a game. We don't have him for a half. They haven't got him for the long term. So they need to actually build a system that is going to be sustainable to keep them up in the Premier League. And I want to see that in my own eyes before saying Mbeumo is a great FPL option. But if he is the penalty taker, then it is a little bit of a game changer. But for number one, I am going to put Mitoma as that man. As I said, I feel like he is one of those incredible flair players that Brighton are essentially relying on in certain situations. His game time was fantastic last season, and his value that he could offer in those opening 3 fixtures, he could be that double-digit man in some of these games. I like what I'm seeing from a goal threat perspective. I want to invest in the goal scorer in these teams, and it looks like he is that man outside of the other 6.5 million options at Brighton. It is worth noting, you could potentially move away in game week 4, so you might be penciling in a transfer. But again, I want the player who's playing in a team that nearly rack up 2 XG per 90. And having Mitoma is going to give me that option in my team. So this is how I am ranking them, guys. Eze number 3, Mbeumo number 2, and Mitoma number 1. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Yes, guys, okay, so that is going to wrap up today's video. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that has helped you a little bit on your quest to picking your 6.5 million midfielder. That just leaves me to say thank you so much for tuning in. If you can drop a like, it would be massively appreciated. And of course, smash that subscribe button. Massive shout out to Fantasy Football Fix. And make sure you join my league. I haven't shouted it out yet, and you legends need to get involved for this season. Thanks so much. Make sure you do check out my most recent video, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Cheers.